Hello. Today we will be discussing Schumann's Piano Sonata in D major, Opus 118, number 2, which comes from a collection entitled Sonatas for the Young. As we would expect based on the title of the piece, it is in sonata form. It contains a two-part exposition, meaning that the primary theme and secondary theme are separated by a medial caesura. It contains a development, which uses a core, and a recapitulation analogous to the exposition, meaning that it is also two-part. So with these preliminary points in mind, let's take a first listen to the piece all the way through and try to pick up on some of these elements that I've just described. Okay, so hopefully you were able to pick up on those first few elements that I discussed. and if not, that's okay, because now we will go into a detailed discussion of each of them. So first we have the exposition. The first part of it is the primary theme. There's no introduction or anything preceding this. And the primary theme is entirely in the home key of D major. It concludes with an imperfect authentic cadence, which then launches us into the transitional material. On the phrase level, the primary theme takes the form of a sentence. So, as we would expect based on Kaplan's model, it contains a 4-measure presentation with 2 basic ideas, and then a 6-measure continuation, which is a little bit less conventional. Normally we would expect a 4-measure continuation, but it's 6 measures because there is some harmonic stretching that occurs within the cadential idea. So now with the score in front of you, let's take another listen to the primary theme and try to really listen for those phrase level elements that I've just described. Okay, and here is a look at the primary theme in a graph form. So again, it is a sentence, and you can see there in the continuation there is some stretching that occurs. And hopefully you were able to hear that when you listened, that the predominant and dominant harmonies feel like they last a little bit longer than they should, and that is just to emphasize that we are heading towards a cadence. And it's kind of interesting that Schumann ends this phrase on an imperfect authentic cadence. Usually we would expect a PAC to end the primary theme, but he really saves that big perfect authentic cadence for the essential expositional closure, which we will discuss soon. So the next element is the transition. It continues to use the piece's main 16th note motive that you've probably been able to pick up on by now. But it starts to gain some energy, it adds some increased surface rhythm, and has just a greater sense of driving towards something. It modulates to the dominant of A major, which we would expect because it is a transitional section, and it's not very tightly knit, so it does not contain any discernible phrase level form. So with that, let's take another listen to the transition, starting with that imperfect authentic cadence that ends the primary theme. So you can really tell after that modulation to A major occurs that the rhythm really starts to pick up. We get running 16th notes and a sforzando there in that measure right after the modulation. So the transition leads us to the medial caesura. The MC is what confirms that we have a 2-part exposition, and it takes the form of a half cadence in the dominant key. It does use caesura fill, meaning that the MC doesn't have any sort of rest after it, so it's not as clear as maybe a medial caesura that we would be used to in a Mozart sonata, for example. But it is in fact confirmed by a dominant lock in the bass and Schumann's use of the word abnehmend, which means decreasing in German. So both of these things indicate a point of stoppage on the dominant. Here's what the medial caesura looks like, and we will take a listen to that. And I'll give you just a few seconds leading up to the MC from the transition. So you can tell in this recording the performer really does kind of give a sense of lifting there at the MC as if we've arrived and it's kind of a resting place for these 2 measures. So continuing on in the exposition, next we have the secondary theme, which introduces a new melodic motive. So this is another thing that confirms that the MC is present, is that we have another theme materializing. But it does continue to utilize that original 16th note motive as well. It's sort of interwoven into the texture. At this point, the dominant key of A major is firmly established. We are in that key for the entire secondary theme, and it really serves to drive towards the EEC, the essential expositional closure. On the phrase level, we have two different phrases in the secondary theme. So the first is a CBI plus continuation, which ends with a half cadence. It's 10 measures instead of 8 because there is some internal adding used. And then the next 15 measures of the secondary theme form a sentence, which ends with a PAC, which is our EEC. And internal adding is used here yet again, so it's a little bit longer than expected. And I thought that it was kind of interesting that together these two theme types kind of form an extended period because of their weak cadence, strong cadence relationship. So that HC that ends the first phrase and the PAC that ends the second phrase kind of make it one long overarching phrase in and of itself. So with this in mind, let's take a listen to the secondary theme, which starts right after the medial caesura. Okay, so there's our secondary theme, and here is a look at the secondary theme in graphing form. So as we have established, we have a CBI plus continuation that begins the secondary theme and a sentence that ends it. And if you look at the continuation piece of the sentence, you can see that there is some adding that occurs, and there is also a PAC that is evaded. So there's a dominant harmony that makes us feel as if that fragmentation is leading us to a cadence, but instead of the tonic that we expect after the dominant harmony, we actually get a 3 chord. So that authentic cadence does not end up happening, and we go through a couple more measures of fragmentation before getting the real cadential idea, which leads us to the PAC in 5, which serves as our essential expositional closure. And we call that one more time technique, and I will discuss that further later in the presentation. So again, that PAC that ends the secondary theme is our essential expositional closure. It really is the first satisfactory PAC in this entire piece. And following it, we get a short codetta, which utilizes that recurring 16th note motive that we've been hearing throughout. And it really serves to just prolong the tonic and arpeggiate it, so it doesn't have any discernible theme type, also because it's extremely short. So now we will take a listen to the short codetta that ends the exposition. So you can hear it really just as arpeggiating the tonic, doesn't really have any other major function besides that. So the next major section of the sonata is of course the development. This development does not contain a pre-chord. It begins immediately with a chord, so it does not use pre-chord chord technique. The chord modulates immediately to the key of 2, or E minor. It does not contain any discernible phrase level form because it's meant to have a kind of a quality of unrest and agitation. The chord is followed kind of interestingly by a standalone 2-measure unit that does continue on with that 16th note motive that we've been hearing throughout the piece. That is present in those 2 measures, but it's not part of the chord because it is not repeated later in sequence. So it's kind of strange that it's kind of just hanging out there by itself, and I'll discuss that further later in the presentation. So here is what the chord sounds like. I'll give you a couple seconds leading up to it from the end of the exposition. So hopefully when we listen through, you could really get that sense of agitation that is so characteristic of the development of a sonata. The minor key is pretty striking compared to the two major keys that we heard before in the exposition. And that two-measure unit there at the end of the core, it doesn't sound totally out of place, but again, it is interesting because it is not part of the core, which is repeated now in sequence. This time we hear it in the key of minor 5, or A minor. And it's an exact sequence, everything is exactly the same, just in a different key. So here is what that sounds like. So following the sequence of the core, we get two two-measure fragments and a retransition back to the original key of D major, and this retransition culminates in a perfect authentic cadence. So the only two development keys are 2 and minor 5, E minor and A minor. And that fragmentation is very characteristic of a development that contains a core. And again, it has a quality of unrest because it's very chromatic and rhythmically driving. So now we will take a listen to those two fragments. Now it could be argued that that second fragment, measures 74 and 75, are in fact part of the retransition because we get a standing on the dominant, and we start to modulate back to D minor or D major at that point. However, I've labeled it in measure 76 because that really seems like kind of a point of rest because we get more calm rhythm happening in the left hand. So here's what the retransition sounds like. And then we're back to the recapitulation, which is exactly analogous to the exposition in both large scale and phrase level form, but this time all the material is in the key of 1 or D major, so we get no modulation to the dominant this time. And the codetta is just a little bit different in the recapitulation. It contains one extra measure and occurs in a higher register, so Schumann really is just driving home that tonic harmony. So you've probably at this point gotten an idea of the main motives of this piece because they are extremely present. The most frequently used motive in this piece is the quarter 16th tie followed by 3/16ths. Those 3/16th notes serve to form a double neighbor figure. So the first two are non-chord tones and the final one completes the triad. So as we can see in this illustration, the E sharp and the G are the non-chord tones, and they surround the F sharp, which is a chord tone. So it adds some harmonic color and interest. The second most frequently used motive consists of a dotted quarter note followed by an ascending or descending eighth note scale. This is primarily used in transitional sections because it has a little bit more of a sense of drive and forward motion and agitation. And the final motive consists of a legato melody that is made up of quarter and half notes in varying contours. This only is seen in the secondary theme sections, and it provides a nice juxtaposition with the agitation of the 16th note motives because it's a little bit more relaxed and rhythmically calm. So on the phrase level, the 10-measure primary theme is an essentially normative Kaplan theme type. It is a sentence, so it has a 4-measure presentation made up of two 2-measure basic ideas. The continuation starts with two 1-measure fragments, which feature increased surface rhythm and accelerated harmonic motion, which are all very characteristic of a continuation. And then there's a 4-measure cadential idea. So usually we would expect a 2-measure cadential idea, but in this case, Schumann uses harmonic stretching of the predominant and dominant harmonies so that each lasts 2 measures instead of 1, making it a 4-measure cadential idea. And here's what that sounds like It's again, very characteristic sentence with the exception of the stretching, but that really just serves to drive us towards the cadence. So an example of an unconventional theme type seen in the exposition is the CBI plus continuation phrase that starts the secondary theme. So it begins pretty normally with a 2-measure basic idea and then a 2-measure contrasting idea, which doesn't cadence, making it a CBI. The continuation also starts normally with 2 1-measure fragments, and after that we would expect to get a 2-measure cadential idea, but instead we get a 2-measure unit that seems to evoke the contrasting idea. It's almost the same, but just in a lower register. So this is not fragmentation because it does not present increased surface rhythm, accelerated harmonic motion, or any of the other characteristics of a continuation. It seems to sort of just be randomly placed there. And then this is followed by a normal, the 2-measure cadential idea that we would expect. So possible interpretations of this abnormal 2-measure unit that seems to be kind of just thrown in there. Schumann perhaps sought to further enforce the presence of the secondary theme material because it occurs so infrequently in the piece. It's possible that he wanted to reinforce that legato texture of the secondary melody in order to juxtapose with the frantic nature of the main 16th note motive that we've been hearing throughout the piece. And it's also possible that the melody of this 2-measure unit serves to lead us into the melody of the cadential idea because it ends on the same pitch as the cadential melody begins on. So here's what that looks like, and we will take a listen to the secondary theme with these elements in mind. Oh, just kidding, hold on. Okay. Okay, and again, here's what that looks like in graphing form. So we can see in that first 6-measure continuation that that unit is kind of just standing alone. It's not fragmentation, but melodically it does make sense. Hopefully you picked up on that when we just listened to it. It doesn't really sound out of place, but when considering Kaplan's models, it does not belong. Okay, so a little bit more about the themes and motives in this piece. Again, the most frequently used motive is that 16th note figure, and it's presented in various formats in nearly every single measure of this piece. It is pretty much omnipresent. So we hear it in the exposition, of course. In the development, we get it in fragmentation, we get it in pieces of the core, and it's also, of course, in the recapitulation because it's analogous to the exposition. And I've used an example here from the codetta just to show that it's not only in the beginning of the recapitulation but also all the way through to the end. Interestingly, there is another seemingly out-of-place 2-measure unit that occurs between iterations of the core. This is sort of similar to the out-of-place 2-measure unit in the secondary theme. And in this case, the overall dominant function of this 2-measure unit seems to give the sense of driving towards a cadence, but when the core returns in sequence, the key changes right away, so we get no sense of harmonic resolution. This adds to the sense of distress and unrest that characterizes the development. The main functions of this main motive are to provide a sense of unity throughout the piece and to outline each chord in a harmonically interesting way, so that double neighbor tone makes it such that the harmony is not straightforward. It's also used in variation. It can be shortened into straight 16th notes and also used as a springboard for running 16th notes that stretch a harmony, such as the one we've examined in the primary theme. So that second motive that consists of a dotted quarter note followed by a scale occurs first in the transition. We also see it in fragmentation in the secondary theme. We see it in the core of the development, in fragmentation in the development. So really, this theme is used most often in fragmentation and transitional material as a means of increasing energy and using rapid harmonic motion to drive towards a cadence. So it's a bit less stable than the first motive. So the third motive, again, has a legato melody made up of quarter and eighth notes in varying contours. It's only seen in the secondary theme sections. It's usually accompanied by a counter melody in the left hand, and it's found in both basic and contrasting ideas in the secondary theme and fragmentation, so it's very, very present in that one section. It provides a nice contrast from the busyness of the primary theme in transition, and it also drives towards the cadential idea, melodically speaking. And these sections still incorporate the main 16th note motive, of course, because it's always present, but it reduces it to supporting material. So a surprising harmonic occurrence in this piece actually happens in the medial caesura. So typically we would expect the MC to be a clear half cadence, but in this case the MC contains harmonic shifts. There is a dominant lock in the bass for the majority of the two measures, but we actually get a shift from 5 to 5/7 to 1/6/4 to 5/7 again. And while all of these are dominant functions, it is kind of unconventional to have an MC that moves around, and it makes it less clear than a typical medial caesura. Another surprising harmonic occurrence comes in the continuation of the S theme's second phrase, that sentence. So in fragmentation, we seem to be driving towards a cadence because we get 4-2-5, so very typical predominant dominant motion and also increased surface rhythm. So the listener anticipates a cadence, but instead after the 5 chord we get a 3 chord. So this undermines any sense of cadence, and one more time technique ensues. So we go back to fragmentation and then finally get a cadential idea several measures later. And this prolongs the arrival of the EEC, so the listener's expectation of that satisfactory cadence in the dominant key is heightened. I will now make some performance recommendations based on knowledge of this piece. So I would recommend that a performer use this awareness of the piece's 3 main motives to accentuate them when appropriate. So we do not need to emphasize the 16th note motive in the S theme sections, but instead the overlying legato melody, because the legato melody is what's important here. The second scalar motive, which has a sense of driving towards a new section, should be performed as such because it is transitional material and it really gives a sense of forward motion to the piece. The performer should use discretion with the primary 16th note motive because it is so present in this piece. The performer really does not need to bring it to the forefront whenever it's there. So make decisions on when it should be background material and when it should be forefront material. I would also recommend that a performer make decisions about his or her own interpretation of the unusual harmonic features of this piece. For example, make a decision about the function of those kind of superfluous 2 measure units found in the exposition and development, and perform them with that decided function in mind. And the performer should play to the listener's expectation by driving sections that lead to a cadence because driving sections occur very frequently in this piece. In my opinion, the most striking feature of this piece is the relentless use of that 16th note motive. As I've said, it is omnipresent in the texture of the piece. It provides an interesting chromaticism with the double neighbor figure, which convolutes otherwise relatively simple harmony. And because this is a sonata for the young, the repetition of this figure is perhaps meant to drill a certain technical idea for young pianists, kind of like an etude. But I also appreciate how, even though this is a sonata for the young, Schumann does not make it simple and straightforward, very harmonically colorful and interesting. Another striking feature is Schumann's evading of cadences. So perfect authentic cadences really only occur at the ends of significant sections, the EEC, ending the exposition, the end of the development, the ESC, and the very end of the piece. Thank you so much. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. I hope that it has brought you some insight into Schumann's Piano Sonata, Opus 118, number 2.